We are mere days away from President-elect Donald Trump taking office. In fact, he may already be there by the time you watch this video, and the incoming president has already expressed some interesting ideas. American expansionism is on his mind, and two territories have established themselves as clear targets for Trump: Greenland and the Panama Canal. Trump has his reasons for having his eyes on both territories. When asked if he would be willing to rule out taking either by force, he gave a cagey response. "I'm not going to commit to that," said the incoming president. "It might be that you'll have to do something. The Panama Canal is vital to our country. We need Greenland for national security purposes." There's a chance that this is just Trump signifying that the US should never rule out going to war with anybody. After all, there's always a chance, no matter how slim, that these territories could turn against the US. Maybe Trump simply doesn't want to rule out military intervention in Panama or Greenland because of that slim chance. Or maybe he has expansion on his mind. Maybe President-elect Donald Trump is preparing for full-scale US military invasions of Greenland and the Panama Canal that would see both territories fall under direct US control. And if that happens, we have some questions. What would the fight look like if Trump used military force to take over Greenland and the Panama Canal? And what would happen in the aftermath of Trump reversing decades of American foreign policy by taking another country's territory? Before we answer those questions, we start with what's happening right now. On January 7th, Trump made his comments about refusing to rule out using military force to acquire either territory. These comments came as a delegation of the president-elect's aides and advisors landed in Greenland, including Donald Trump Jr., as part of an unofficial visit to the autonomous country. That's an important territorial distinction to make. Greenland, though capable of self-rule, is part of the Kingdom of Denmark. That will play a key role in what happens if Trump chooses to invade, as well as what happens afterward. But we'll come back to the Denmark factor later. Right now, the US has no major strategic control over either territory. It has a large military base in Greenland, the Pitufik Space Base. Established in 1941 when the US occupied Greenland as part of the Allies' war against Nazi Germany and the Axis powers in World War II, the base was originally known as the Tula Air Base, until its rebranding in 2023. Regardless, the base stands as America's northernmost military installation and exists thanks to a joint agreement between the US and Denmark. It's home to the 12th Space Warning Squadron and the Satellite Command and Control Division of the 23rd Space Squadron. Together, those squadrons use a solid-state phased array radar to track the skies for missiles. That essentially makes Greenland an early warning system for the US in case an enemy power, such as Russia, launches intercontinental ballistic missiles at America. Greenland has a strategic importance even if the US only controls Pitufik as part of an agreement with Denmark. As for the Panama Canal, that's been under the sole control of Panama since 1999. The US used to control the canal, though it returned it to Panama in 1979. What followed was a 20-year joint partnership in which the US helped Panama govern the strategic waterway until the 1999 full handover. So the US has a history with Greenland and the Panama Canal. And it's possible Trump will use that history as justification for US invasions. Trump is certainly coming out with rhetoric that suggests he has designs on the territories. For instance, Trump posted the following to his Truth Social account before Trump Jr. and the president-elect's aides landed in Greenland. "Don Jr. and my reps landing in Greenland. The reception has been great. They and the free world need safety, security, strength, and peace. This is a deal that must happen. MAGA, make Greenland great again." Those certainly sound like the words of the president-elect who has his eyes on a particular prize, but they've been met with a more diplomatic response from Denmark. Speaking to Danish broadcaster TV2, the country's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen called the US Denmark's most important and closest ally. She also said that she welcomes the US taking a greater interest in Greenland, though that interest would have to be done in a way that is respectful of the Greenlandic people, while being mindful that Denmark, like the US, is a member of NATO. Trump hasn't been quite as direct with his MAGA rhetoric when it comes to the Panama Canal, but he has made mention of it being vital to the United States, while also inferring that the canal is currently being operated by China. Panama's president, Jose Raul Mulino, has also responded to Trump's comments, saying in no uncertain terms that the sovereignty of our canal is not negotiable and is part of our history of struggle and irreversible conquest. So it's a no to US control from both Greenland and Panama. But this all brings us to an interesting question. Why would Trump want Greenland and the Panama Canal in the first place? We've touched on a couple of these reasons already. Greenland is home to a vital US military base that essentially acts as America's eyes in the sky for incoming missiles. Trump's logic may be that controlling Greenland would allow the US to reinforce that base and create others without having to get permission from Denmark. Greenland would thus become one of America's most important strategic assets in the Arctic and offer America some control over waterways commonly used by Russia. There's also the melting ice factor to consider. Climate change has led to ice north of Greenland melting. opening up new potential shipping routes upon which the United States, China, and Russia all have their eyes. Trump has practically said as much in the past. "You don't even need binoculars, you look outside," Trump said when referring to Greenland's proximity to the United States. "You have China ships all over the place. You have Russian ships all over the place. We're not letting that happen. We're not letting that happen." To Trump, gaining control of Greenland doesn't just mean more autonomy when it comes to managing its eyes in the sky. Greenland would give the US the means to somewhat govern the emerging Northwest Passage and, by extension, the shipping that could begin to flow through the passage as more ice melts. Of course, it also helps that Greenland has oil, natural gas, and reserves of up to 31 different minerals, including graphite and lithium, that Trump would love to bring under American control. Graphite and lithium would be especially big gets for Trump. Right now, China controls about 65% of the world's graphite production, with most lithium being mined by China, Chile, and Australia. Having control over some vital rare elements, with lithium being especially important because of its use in electronics, would allow the US to wrest portions of the market for these materials from China. Speaking about China, that brings us back to the Panama Canal. Trump's claims that China controls the Panama Canal aren't completely unfounded. The Hong Kong-based company CK Hutchison currently manages 2 ports near the canal's entrance, which has in the past led to Trump claiming that Panama overcharges American ships using the waterway. Panama was also the first Latin American country to sign up for China's Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. The BRI is an ambitious project that sees China helping other countries to build infrastructure off the back of loans that China provides. It's often seen as a way for China to build its influence in the countries that become members, a concern that may be on Trump's mind when it comes to Panama. The Atlantic Council says that the US and its partners offer little alternative to China on the investment front in Panama, though it does offer $3.8 billion in foreign investment annually. That places Panama in a tough position: favor the US to continue securing that aid or move closer to China in the hope that the investment it offers supplants what the US spends on Panama. For his part, Molino rejects these claims of influence. "There is absolutely no Chinese interference or involvement in anything to do with the Panama Canal," claims Panama's president. But that statement may not be enough to dissuade Trump, especially with the BRI and Hong Kong-controlled ports being factored into the equation. According to the trade publication Cargo Now, around 40% of America's container shipping travels through the Panama Canal on its way to other destinations in the world. If Trump truly believes that Panama overcharges the US for this container transit, he may also believe that taking control of the Panama Canal would mean that US shipping becomes cheaper. Maybe American ships would no longer need to pay at all if the canal was under US control. Plus, America would make a major profit by charging ships from other countries whatever it wants to use the waterway. So there are clear benefits to the US taking over both Greenland and the Panama Canal. And the interesting thing is that the US has prior when it comes to both territories. The US military has gotten directly involved in Panama before. In December 1989, thousands of American troops descended on the country by land, air, and sea to oust General Manuel Noriega from his seat of power in Panama. Dubbed Operation Just Cause, the invasion came on the back of Panamanian forces killing a US service member and saw more than 20,000 American soldiers invade the country. The US took control of Panama's key military installations and ousted Noriega, killing at least 514 Panamanian soldiers and civilians in the process. So America has invaded Panama before. It could do it again under Trump. There hasn't been any similar invasion by US forces in Greenland before, but America's interest in the territory is long-standing. Back in 1946, Greenland was still a Danish colony rather than being the autonomous, though still Danish-ruled, territory it is today. The US had seen how valuable the massive island could be, leading to then US President Harry S. Truman making a secret offer of $100 million to buy Greenland from Denmark. The offer was rejected and only came to light in 1991 upon the end of the Cold War, but it set a precedent for the US wanting control of Greenland. Trump has also touched on buying the island before, leading some to believe that he would almost treat such a purchase as one of the real estate deals for which he's most famous. The interest is there. The US would love to control both Greenland and the Panama Canal. The question now is what would happen if Trump follows through on his vague threats of military action. Starting with the fighting itself, neither Greenland nor Panama has much of a chance of standing up to the might of the United States military. According to Global Firepower, or GFP, which ranks the top 145 military nations based on 60 criteria, the US has the world's strongest military. Over 1.3 active members make up its ranks, with another 799,500 in reserve. The US has the world's most powerful air force, with 13,209 aerial assets, about 14% of which are fighter jets that are in easy range of both Panama and Greenland, thanks to America's aerial tanker fleet of 606 planes. These tankers can refuel fighter jets in the air, easily allowing the US to keep its planes above both territories. Add America's 472-asset Navy, the second largest by asset amount in the world, and you have a nation that would barely even need to scrape the surface of its massive ground power to cause serious damage to Panama and Greenland. As for the two territories, they don't have a lot to offer in resistance. Panama is protected by the Panamanian Public Forces. They're so small that they present practically no threat to the US. This paramilitary group has 80,000 soldiers and a minimal amount of equipment. The 38 aircraft, 262 military vehicles, and 30 naval assets controlled by the Panamanian Public Forces aren't going to amount to much in the face of US aggression. Panama would also have to deal with the loss of $3.8 billion in foreign investment it receives from the US each year if Trump invades, making those security forces even less effective. Greenland would put up a little bit more of a fight. Though the island doesn't have a military of its own, Danish ownership means that the Danes will be drawn into any fight that the US tries to start. Right now, Greenland is protected by the 1st Squadron of the Royal Danish Navy, though that only amounts to 7 patrol vessels and a royal yacht used for surveillance purposes. Assuming Denmark decides to stand its ground and fight for Greenland rather than capitulating to the US, it would bring an active military of 20,000 personnel to the fight. It would also be able to draw on paramilitary forces numbering 51,000 and around 12,000 reserves, but it would be at a severe manpower disadvantage. Denmark at least has a better air force than Panama thanks to its 117 aerial assets, but its navy wouldn't be much use against the US. Denmark only counts 9 frigates among its 50 vessels, with the rest being patrol ships and similarly non-threatening assets. Simply put, the wars would be whitewashes. Even if Denmark and Panama found some way to combine their forces, a difficult prospect given that Greenland and Panama are separated by the Atlantic Ocean, the US would steamroll over both of them in direct military engagements. Trump would gain control of Greenland and the Panama Canal if he decided to involve America's military. But what would happen next? We'll start with Greenland because that particular island offers a unique wrinkle to Trump's plans. Denmark is a member of NATO. By default, that also makes Greenland a NATO member, due to Denmark's ownership of the autonomous territory. If Trump invades Greenland, he runs the risk of triggering Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, which states that all NATO members come directly to the aid of any NATO member that experiences an invasion of its own soil. Therein lies the unique wrinkle. The United States is also a NATO member, and is by far the most powerful of the organization's 32 member countries. By triggering Article 5, Trump would essentially force the rest of the group's members to attack the United States, at least in the defense of Greenland. If the ensuing war expanded to the point that any of these member nations attacked the US on its own soil, that would also trigger Article 5. The whole invasion would be a diplomatic catastrophe from NATO's perspective, forcing its members to choose between supporting the US, NATO's biggest source of power, or protecting Denmark's territory from the very country upon which NATO relies for most of its strength. It's a situation that has never happened before, and likely one that no NATO member has anticipated. What happens when an ally takes action that makes it an enemy under NATO's own guidelines? It's almost impossible to tell, though the likely answer is that the rest of NATO would hold fire on attacking the US, rather than plunge all of Europe into war and leave openings for countries like Russia to further their ambitions. NATO could at least put up a fight against the US. Even without America, NATO has 1.5 million active personnel spread across its other 31 members, which slightly exceeds the active personnel in the US military. It also understands how to launch combined arms attacks, thanks in part to its training with the US. Britain and France would also allow the non-US members of NATO to present a nuclear threat, though their combined 515 warheads are dwarfed by America's total of 5,748. It would be a devastating fight if it happened. Remember that Trump has previously threatened to pull the US out of NATO if the rest of the member nations don't pay their way. He's still maintaining part of that rhetoric. On January 5, 2025, he told reporters they can all afford it, but they should be at 5%, not 2%. For context, NATO recommends that its members dedicate at least 2% of their gross domestic products to defense. It seems that paying their way amounts to most of NATO's other members more than doubling their defense outlay to keep Trump happy. So maybe the complex diplomatic situation will be made simpler by Trump pulling the US out of NATO, but that would still mean war between the world's single most powerful country and a military alliance that almost matches it in sheer numbers and strength. Trump might argue that America's invasion of Greenland is what Greenlanders actually want. He implies as much with his "Make Greenland Great Again" comments. But that doesn't seem to be the case either. On January 10th, The Guardian ran a piece in which it asked Greenlanders what they think about Trump's desire to control their island. Ole Hjorth, a 27-year-old, summed up the general mood when he said, "Talk of annexing us is both terrifying and ridiculous. If he used military force, that would mean going to war with the rest of NATO and implementing sanctions and tariffs on Denmark, and therefore the rest of the EU as well. Another Greenlander, named Patrick Abrahamson, said military action would take away Greenland's voice and dehumanize its population. However, there were some who said they might welcome American occupation. Hans-Peter Bay, age 39, says that he's always expected that one of the world's 3 major military powers would have designs on Greenland if it becomes independent from Denmark. "I hope Trump will make a better agreement with us than the current one we have with Denmark," he says, "and most importantly, see us as equal partners." So there's at least some softness toward Trump in Greenland. But the majority opinion is that Greenlanders don't want US control, and the war that would ensue between the US and NATO would be devastating, as well as opening up opportunities for Russia and China to enhance their influence. Speaking of China, we come to the Panama Canal. Trump taking over this vital waterway wouldn't trigger the same international warfare that might happen if he invades Greenland. It would also be financially beneficial to the United States. Beyond the US being able to essentially give itself free shipping through the canal if it took control, it would also be about taking advantage of the fact that around 5% of global maritime trade passes through the waterway. That's roughly $270 billion of cargo being transported annually, with the US having the ability to charge every ship that uses the Panama Canal if it has control. In 2021 alone, the Panama Canal took $2.97 billion of revenue, which would make it a nice little earner for the US. America would also try to use its new influence to force Panama to withdraw from China's BRI scheme. In truth, taking over the Panama Canal would mean invading Panama itself, meaning the entire country would end up under American control. That would anger China. Its growing influence over the canal would be cut immediately, as you have to imagine that Trump would look for some way to get rid of the Chinese-owned ports currently operating on the waterway. Would that be enough for war to break out between the US and China? It might, though the prospect is unlikely. China would likely see the Panama Canal as a failed investment. Sure, it would lose the modicum of control having ports in Panama grants it over global shipping, but it's already successfully used Panama to break the ice for BRI in Latin America. 22 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean are now part of China's infrastructure initiative, so influence in Panama could be an acceptable loss. So where does that leave Trump's potential plans to take over Greenland and the Panama Canal? The latter seems like a more viable prospect than the former. The US would destroy Panama in a straight fight, and Panama has no security alliances that would trigger a war. China wouldn't be happy, but it's unlikely to spark a global fight with the US over the loss of influence in Panama. Greenland is a far more difficult prospect. If Trump takes that island, he's not just going to war with Denmark. He risks destroying NATO, a prospect that would have decades-long consequences for the global power balance. But what do you think about Trump's plans for Greenland and the Panama Canal? Will he use military force? What would happen if he did? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video.